There are few certainties in this world, but one of them is that if you are listening to this podcast, then you likely would have been accused of witchcraft. Maybe you were simply a woman. Maybe you had too many children, or indeed too few. Maybe your neighbours were unable to conceive. Maybe milk in your house had soured. Maybe you didn't brush your hair. Or maybe you let your toenail clippings fall onto the kitchen floor. The reason for accusations of witchcraft were as numerous as they were arbitrary. And there were, of course, some people who were accused of witchcraft who simply followed the old path. They were healers and wise people who generally lived on the fringes of society and were both feared and often respected. This story is not a story about witch trials, but it starts with a witch, or at least what the villagers thought was a witch. Little is known about the Willington witch, but what we do know is that she was notorious. She lived on a plot of land in Willington in the early 1700s, and it would seem that people were really frightened of her. There's no record that demonstrates what she actually did, but she was so notorious that she was written about by Montague Summers, a Catholic priest, who documented her in his book, The Geography of Witchcraft. There are also allegations that the Willington witch was so despised that she was even denied a deathbed confession and conversion, which was highly unusual at the time. After her death, the cottage was ripped down. Despite the fact that we've no real knowledge as to what the Willington witch was supposed to have actually done, her cottage and the land around where it sat was rumoured to have been cursed after she died, and the local people feared the consequences of disturbing the land. There is some speculation that the witch was actually a midwife named Mrs. Pepper. Mrs. Pepper was accused of witchcraft. She practiced a strange mix of Roman Catholicism and Wicca, and as a result people feared her immensely. We can also speculate that there was a perceived power with the knowledge of how to bring children into the world, and perhaps if things went wrong during the birth, an easy scapegoat to blame would be Mrs. Pepper. She was subsequently cleared of all her charges, and all records about her disappear, but at the same time as Mrs. Pepper disappeared from record, a man named Mr. Oxon built a cottage for his mother-in-law on Willington Quay. Willington Quay was just an average small village of average people, and it had everything you could possibly need. The Willington Mill was built in either 1800 or 1806, but there is evidence that the new mill was built on an existing mill. Right from the offset, the mill had a bad reputation. Locals talked about a dark aura that resided above it, a dark cloud that hung over the building, and there were rumours that during the construction of the building, a woman had been brutally murdered and maybe hidden in the walls. These rumours were unsubstantiated, but they persisted nonetheless. And of course, there was the rumours that the land around the mill had been cursed by an evil witch 100 years before. The new mill was constructed by 3 men, Joseph Proctor, Joseph Unthank, and William Brown. It is rumoured that the alleged murder of the woman in the construction of the mill was connected to the Brown family, and it is true that Brown inexplicably left the business while it was thriving and moved his family away. After Brown left, the Unthank family moved in. There is record that Unthank was warned that the mill was haunted prior to him moving his family in, but he was undeterred by the rumours. While Unthank was living in the house, the family began to hear and see strange things. Unthank reported that he heard a mangle going all night long, and was so perturbed by it that he inquired with the housekeeper as to whether anyone in the household was operating a mangle all night, or whether there was a mangle in the house at all. There was no mangle in the house, and no machine that would be making the kind of noise that he described. We also know for a fact that in the time that Joseph Unthank and his family lived in the 3-storey mill, they never used the 2nd floor, and they kept a room on the 3rd floor permanently locked, even going as far as bricking up the windows. Eventually, Joseph Unthank moved his family out of the house, and subsequently denied ever having any paranormal experiences in the building. After the Unthanks vacated the property, Joseph Proctor moved his family in. By 1842, Joseph Unthank and Joseph Proctor had passed away, and their sons, Charles Unthank and Joseph Proctor Jr., were left in charge of the mill. And this is where our story really begins. The Unthanks left the mill in 1831, and young Joseph Proctor moved in. After young Joseph Proctor died in 1875, his son Edmund discovered that he had kept a diary of all of the strange events that occurred in the mill. The following incidents took place over a period of 5.5 years. It started with the nursemaid. At night, she would be left to tend the baby in the nursery on the second floor, and initially the noises she heard did not bother her. She simply assumed they were the sounds of the house settling, or the sounds of someone moving around upstairs. In the quiet of the night, she began to hear footsteps trudge across the floor above her head, but one night the footsteps were relentless. They paced back and forth across the floor, becoming more and more frantic. Heavy steps that were pounding up and down, until eventually a huge thud shook the nursery so much that the windows rattled. The combination of the windows rattling and the dawning realisation of where the steps were coming from were enough for the nursemaid to finally report her fears. The steps were coming from the locked room above, the room with the boarded up windows, and she knew for a fact that the door had been nailed shut as long as she had been there. And then, Joseph Proctor Jr. had decided to open it up. The nails were removed from the door, and on entering the room, Proctor observed that there was no furniture, and the window and the fireplace had been boarded up, as if to keep something in. Numerous times, staff had heard footsteps in what was to become known as the disturbed room. Staff would check the room, and there would obviously be nobody there. As ideas about status at the time dictated, the worries and concerns of the staff weren't taken seriously and were seen to be the superstitions of local people, until Proctor's wife heard the footsteps and the banging from the disturbed room while she was in the nursery. She wondered why the maid was cleaning out the room, and upon inquiry, she realised that there was no one in the room at all. This pattern continued. The maid who had witnessed the window rattle had quit her post soon after the incident, herself rattled by the continuous noises at night. When a new maid entered the household, Proctor forbade anyone in the house from mentioning the disturbed room to her. It was only a few days before she too inquired about the person continuously pacing in the disturbed room. The household eventually deduced that the sound was that of a man, pacing to the window and back again, and stomping angrily in heavy boots. And then the activity moved outside of the room and seeped into the rest of the house. Proctor and his wife settled down to bed one night and were barely in bed when a strange sound reverberated around their bedroom, the distinct sound of a mallet hitting wood at least 12 times. No cause for the sound could be determined. A few nights later, they settled the baby into the crib next to their bed. As Proctor stood over the crib to ensure the baby was settled, he heard the sound of metal clang against the leg of the crib, and the wood of the crib vibrated against his hands as they rested on the bars. Workers in the mill reported hearing the noise of particular machinery in the mill yard in operation that had been sitting idle all night, and no explanation could be found for the sounds. It was also around this time that a local villager passing the mill reported seeing the transparent white figure of a woman standing in the second-story window of the mill. Mr. and Mrs. Mann lived in a cottage on the grounds of the property, and they had free use of the coal that was used for the mill. One night Mrs. Mann went to the coal shed in order to top up for the night, and as she approached the house, something made her stop in her tracks. She could see a white figure in the second-story window. She stopped and stared in amazement as the apparition paced by the window, stopping every so often to apparently gaze out of the window. The apparition was translucent and glowing in the darkness. There was no moon and no natural light, so the glowing was stark against the black night. Mrs. Mann called frantically for her husband, who appeared by her side and followed her gaze to the figure that was still glowing in the window, pacing and pausing, pacing and pausing. As they watched, they began to make sense of what they were seeing. They realised that the figure in the window seemed to be a priest, and also seemed to be slowly disappearing before their eyes. Mr. Mann ran to the door of the Proctors in order to rouse John Proctor to witness the bizarre event, but the door remained unanswered. The noises in the house continued, with phantom sounds happening regularly. The family heard the sounds of footsteps, of the hammering of wood, of a clock being wound, and of heavy sacks being dropped on the floor from a height. But until this point, whatever was in the house had refrained from any physical interaction with the family. One night, Elizabeth Proctor and her nursemaid were in bed, tending to one of the children. Elizabeth was on the bed when she felt the strange sensation of being weightless. She looked around in shock, fully aware that she was still firmly planted on the bed, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The bed had risen fully off the floor and then lowered slowly back to the ground. She sat on the bed, barely daring to breathe, and felt as the bed rose up once more and again a further time. She would later describe to her son Edmund that it felt as though a man was rising the bed with his back and lowering it down again. Her eyes slid to Pollard, the nursemaid, who had her back to her and seemed to be fast asleep. In shock, Elizabeth sat frozen on the bed until hours had passed, and she felt it was safe to try and sleep. In the morning over breakfast, Elizabeth was still puzzling over the night's events, and was shocked when her nursemaid timidly approached her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to intrude, but I was wondering if you felt anything strange last night. Something happened and I'm not sure if I dreamed it." And it wasn't long after this incident that Proctor woke the house screaming for a light. "Bring me a light! For God's sake, someone bring me a light!" He had felt his bed rise into the air and needed desperately to check the room. Perhaps one of the most terrifying experiences for the family so far happened to a visitor to the house. Jane Carr was the aunt of the children and was visiting for a while. She had heard knocks, bangs and footsteps and was refusing to sleep on her own, so had requested that the cook Mary Young spend the night in the room with her. It is important to note that both women were awake at the time of this event, and this is taken directly from the diary of Proctor. Mary Young heard the slot in the door apparently slide back, the handle turn, and the door to open. A rushlight was burning on the dressing table, but the bed was an old four-poster, and the curtains being drawn, nothing could be seen. A step then went to the rushlight, and appeared by the sound to snuff it, and then lay down the snuffers. In the act of the snuffing, the light was transiently obscured, as when the act is customarily performed. Jane C. then felt it raise up the clothes over her twice. Then they both heard something rustle the curtains as it went around the bed. On getting to Mary Young's side, she distinctly saw a dark shadow on the curtain. On getting to the bedboard, where Jane C. lay, a loud thump, as with a fist, was heard on it. Something was then felt to press the counterpane on Mary Young's side of the bed, the curtain being pushed in, but nothing more seen. Whatever the visitor might be was then heard to go out, seeming to leave the door open. In the morning they found the door still bolted, as it was left when they went to bed. In this occurrence, Jane C. heard and felt everything as described, but having her head under the bedclothes, could not see the shadow as her companion did. This incident felt different to the others. It felt dark and threatening. The purposeful snuffing of the lamp to obscure its identity, the shadow on the bed curtains, and the fist slamming against the board seemed darker than the other incidents. The poltergeist activity continued and escalated, with regular whistling being heard throughout the house, as well as the customary thumps and bangs. But little Jane, the Proctor's now 4.5-year-old daughter, began to talk about a head that she had seen at night time at the end of her bed. She described the head as being like that of an old woman, covered in a shroud of some sort. She said the head was watching her, and the old woman had raised a finger on each hand, pressing them together as she watched Jane in bed. Jane buried her head under the covers and eventually fell asleep. The children had all reported at various points hearing bangs and crashes around the house. But now they began to report hearing voices in the rooms with them. Voices that seemed to be saying strange and inconsequential words like, "Never mind," and "Come here." The children's beds were shaking at night time, and the banging, dragging and knocks continued. It was then that the family agreed to hold a vigil. The vigil was scheduled to occur on the 3rd of July 1840, when the Proctors and the majority of their staff were due to be on holiday. Edward Drury, a local and respected doctor, and chemist Thomas Hudson were the two men who would take part in this vigil. The strange part about this section of this curious little tale is that neither Hudson nor Drury knew the other one was going to be there, and they seemed to have not liked each other very much. Even stranger than this is that Joseph Proctor also turned up at the house, despite having to travel a really long way back earlier than his family from his trip. Despite organising with the remaining staff that these two men would be staying, and despite the men not knowing that he was going to be there. The men sat down to eat prior to commencing the vigil, and it is suggested that prior to the dinner, both men were sceptical about the validity of the alleged haunting. But after listening to Proctor's testimony over dinner, they were convinced by his earnestness that the haunting was very real. At around 11 p.m, Drury and Hudson made their way upstairs and settled themselves opposite the door to the disturbed room, where Proctor believed much of the activity was emanating from. For a while there was nothing. Sounds that they heard could have been credited to the house, machinery nearby, or the sound of wagon wheels, so they dismissed them immediately. But then sounds began that they could not rationalise. They heard the pitter-patter of bare feet running across the wooden floorboards. They heard and felt raps on the floorboards beneath their feet. Coughing and rustling came from the empty corridors, as if someone wearing a bustling dress was sweeping down the hallway. And then Drury saw her. Hudson had opted to close his eyes and doze for a few minutes, and Drury picked up his pocket watch to check the time. As he put his pocket watch away, he described something momentous. In taking my eyes away from the watch, they became riveted upon a closet door, which I distinctly saw open, and also saw the figure of a female attired in greyish garments, with the head inclining downwards, and her left hand pressed upon her chest as if in pain. The other, the right hand, extended towards the floor with the index finger pointing downwards. It advanced, with an apparently cautious step across the floor towards me. Immediately as it approached my friend who was slumbering, its right hand was extended towards him. I then rushed at it, giving at the time, as Mr. Proctor states, a most awful yell, but instead of grasping it, I fell upon my friend, and I recollected nothing distinctly for nearly 3 hours afterwards. I have since learned that I was carried downstairs in an agony of fear and terror. With the vigil being a success, word was fast spreading in the area about the haunting of Willington Mill, and of course people suspected a decades-old curse from a long-dead witch. But for the Proctor family, they were forced to continue living in this cursed place, dealing with the constant poltergeist activity. Elizabeth was plagued with episodes of sleep paralysis, which terrified her deeply. The children began to report more and more activity. Little Joseph reported hearing his own name being called, in his own voice, which deeply terrified him. Little Joseph and Henry reported seeing a white face peering down at them between the banisters of the stairs, and as they watched, the creature, whatever it was, seemed to bound away down the corridor with huge leaps. More alarmingly, little Joseph reported that when he entered his bedroom one day, there was a woman sitting on his bed, staring at him, except that she had no eyes, only empty black holes where her eyes should be. The toddler, Edmund, became absolutely petrified of his crib and would scream and cry at something that no one else could see. He regularly talked about a funny cat that no one else could see and would follow it around and search for it under chairs and tables. A local woman reported seeing a strange cat-like creature that was larger than a domestic cat and had an elongated snout and was snow white. It walked through a closed gate onto the Proctor's property, where it was seen by Joseph Proctor and was also seen a number of times in and around the property. Similarly, a man who was courting Mary Young at the time reported seeing a similar creature, and when he swung his foot to kick at it, his foot went through the creature and the creature disappeared. He got such a shock that he thought it was best to report it to Mr. Proctor just in case. And then there was a monkey. It is not often that we come across a phantom monkey in any of these stories, but that is exactly what happened here. The children were in their playroom together, and little Joseph was sitting on top of a dresser when he felt something tug at his trouser leg. And when he looked down, it was a monkey. He screamed and jumped down from the dresser, and the children gave chase after the monkey as it bounded out the door and into another room. They saw it disappear under the bed. The children were found running around frantically searching for this monkey that they swore they saw. To be honest, I probably wouldn't have included this encounter if it wasn't for what Edmund wrote about it later. He said, "Now it so happens that this monkey is the first incident in the hauntings, or whatever they may be termed, of which I have any recollection. I suppose it was or might easily be the first monkey I had ever seen, which may explain my memory being so impressed that I have not forgotten it. A monkey, and upstairs in the nursery. That is the business. My parents have told me that no monkey was known to be owned in the neighbourhood, and after diligent inquiry, no organ man or hurdy-gurdy boy, either with or without a monkey, had been seen anywhere about that place or neighbourhood, either on that day or for a length of time. Although I freely admit that the evidence of an infant barely 2 years old is of very small import, yet I may say I have an absolutely distinct recollection of that monkey, and of running to see where it went to, as it hopped out of the room and into the adjoining blue room. We saw it go under the bed in that room, but it could not be found or traced anywhere afterwards. We hunted and ferreted about the room and every corner of the house, but no monkey or any trace of one was more to be found. I don't know what to make of such a visitation, and I have no explanation to offer, but that it was a monkey, that it disappeared under the bed in the blue room that Saturday afternoon and was never seen or heard of again. This is not merely from my childhood recollection, but from the repeated confirmation of my brothers and sisters in afterlife. I am perfectly certain. I am merely recording the facts as simply as I can. Readers may smile and mock as seemeth good unto them. I cannot alter what has taken place to suit either them or anyone else." The noises and disturbances continued. Little Joseph reported that an old man had appeared in his bedroom, and in a separate incident, he reported that he had seen a version of himself pacing around his bedroom silently, but little Joseph was too petrified to call out to anyone for assistance. The family continued to hear crashes, bangs, footsteps, voices, the rustling of dresses, and so on, and the diary abruptly ends in August 1842. Edmund added a note to state that although the diary ended, the family had indeed witnessed more phenomena around the house and grounds. The Proctor family left the grounds in 1847. Now, I don't normally include the testimony of psychics in stories like this as evidence, but there is an interesting story of a psychic attached to the Willington Mill. The Society for Psychical Research published an interesting little tale about a man identified as Dr. F, who had discovered through hypnotism sessions that a woman named Jane seemed to possess psychic abilities. Jane had approached him about her inability to sleep soundly, and he suspected that she was clairvoyant. He knew of the case of the Willington Mill and decided that he would use the story of the Willington Mill to try and understand Jane's alleged abilities. Jane knew nothing of what the content of the session would be prior to beginning it, and the full transcript of the sessions were printed by the Society for Psychical Research. In these sessions, Jane recounted the following about Willington Mill. A Quaker man had lived there and had fled the house after seeing apparitions of a woman. A woman not married to the gentleman had died in the house, and Jane was of the opinion that the man of the house had something to do with her death. A lady with white skin flits around the house, and Jane described her as having eyes but having no sight. Jane advised that the woman was connected to the cellar. Something had happened in the cellar, some mischief, and that woman was connected to the cellar. Jane also saw another woman in the house, and the woman was violently angry, and she somehow was connected to animals. Jane suggested that she had a monkey and an animal that resembled a cat, but it wasn't a cat, but she couldn't identify what the animal actually was. She said there was a man in the house that would stomp around angrily and that he was a priest. Brown, Unthank and Proctor were all indeed Quakers. And here's the interesting bit. There is a cellar in Willington Mill, and it is never mentioned in the diaries. At some point, while he was a resident there, Joseph Proctor ordered the excavation of the cellar, and during the excavation, the workers found a large stone slab that they believed was concealing something. When the slab was discovered, Proctor immediately called off the investigation and bid the workers to down tools, and the slab was never investigated.